Hello friends, my name is Sachin Malik and in this video we are going to learn about weak pawn. A weak pawn is a pawn in opponent's position that cannot be defended by any other pawn. Take a look at this pawn. This d5 pawn cannot be defended by any other black's pawn. There is no pawn on the c file to defend this d5 pawn and there is no pawn on the e file to defend this d5 pawn. So we can say that this d5 pawn is a weak pawn. If you compare this b6 pawn with the d5 pawn, then b6 pawn can be defended with the a7 pawn. So b6 is not a weak pawn. Now let's see how we can attack this weak d5 pawn. We can start by playing rook a to d1. We are attacking this weak pawn. Now black must defend it. Black can play rook f d8 and now white should play rook to d4. Idea is to bring another rook to d1 and attack on this weak d5 pawn. Now black has to protect it twice. So black plays rook to d6. And when white plays rook f to d1, black plays rook a d8 and protects this pawn twice. Now on this weak pawn there are two attackers, d4 rook and d1 rook, and black has two defenders, d6 rook and d8 rook. So right now we cannot win this pawn, but white can bring one more attacker. White can play e4 and attack this weak pawn one more time. Black cannot capture our pawn because if black captures our pawn, then we can play rook cross d6 and after rook cross d6 we will win one rook. So let's go back. Now black cannot capture our pawn, so let's say black plays a move like king f8. Now we can simply capture this pawn and we have the material advantage of one pawn. So that's how we attack a weak pawn and win it. Let's look at another example. In this position we are black. Can you identify a weak pawn in white's position? Take a look at this pawn. This c3 pawn cannot be defended by any other pawn. So we can say that this c3 pawn is a weak pawn. What about a2 pawn? a2 pawn also cannot be defended by any other white pawn. So we can say that a2 pawn is also a weak pawn. But right now we don't have any direct way to attack a2 pawn. So we can start attacking the c3 pawn. We can play rook f to c8. We are attacking this weak pawn with our rook and now white has to protect it. White plays rook f c1 to defend the pawn and now we can double on the c file. We can play rook c4. Idea is to play rook a c8 and put more pressure on the c3 pawn. White plays rook c2. Now after rook a c8 we are attacking this pawn twice. So white brings another rook to defend it twice. So right now we cannot win this pawn. If we want to win this pawn, we have to attack it one more time. So black plays b5. Idea is to play b4 and attack it one more time. After b4, white cannot capture our pawn because rook cross c2 and we will win a rook. So white plays e3 and white does not want to allow b4. But now after a3 this pawn is weak and we can attack on this weak pawn. Black played rook a4 attacking this weakness. This is a weak pawn because this pawn cannot be defended by any other white pawn. So white must defend this weak pawn with the rook. White plays rook a1 to defend this pawn and now black has a very good move. Black can play pawn to b4. White cannot capture this pawn with a pawn because of this pin and white cannot capture our b4 pawn with c pawn because of this pin. So let's say white plays a move like rook here. Now we can win a pawn. We can capture this pawn or we can also capture this pawn. Let's play rook cross c3. And after rook cross c3, b cross c3, we have won a pawn. Now let's go to the next example. In this position, we are black. Can you identify weak pawns in white's position? Let's see. This a2 pawn is weak because there is no other pawn that can defend it. What about c3 pawn? This pawn is also weak pawn because no other white pawn can defend it. So is the c4 pawn. c4 pawn is also weak because there is no other white pawn to defend it. What about the d5 pawn? d5 pawn is not weak because it is protected by other white pawns. What about e4 pawn? It's not weak because white can play f3 and protect the pawn. And what about these three pawns? These pawns are also not weak because if we attack f2 pawn, then white can play f3 and now f3 pawn is protected by the g2 pawn, so it's not a weak pawn. Similarly, if we attack any of these two pawns, white can simply push these pawns one step forward and these pawns are not weak. So what are the weak pawns? a2, c3 and c4. These three pawns are weak. So how do we attack these pawns? Which pawn should we attack? Well, it depends on the placement of the pieces. Now let's put some pieces in this position. Now our knight is on a5, which is attacking c4 pawn, and bishop can also come to a6 and attack the c4 pawn. So if the piece placement is this, then the weakness of the a2 pawn and the c3 pawn is irrelevant. We cannot attack a2 pawn or c3 pawn because our pieces are not in a position to attack these two pawns. So despite the weakness of a2 and c3 pawn, we have to focus on the c4 pawn because c4 pawn can be easily attacked by our pieces. We can play bishop to a6. Both the knight and the bishop are attacking the c4 pawn and it can be only defended once with the d3 bishop. So white will lose this pawn and with it white will also lose the game because let's say white plays king here, we can take this, white takes it, black plays knight cross c4 and now black has the material advantage of 1 point and in this position it is enough to win this game. Let's look at one more example. In this position we are white. Can you identify a weak pawn in black's position? Let's talk about this pawn. This pawn a7 cannot be defended by any other pawn, so it's a weak pawn. b6 pawn is not a weak pawn because it is defended by the a7 pawn. c5 pawn is also not a weak pawn because it is defended by these two pawns. What about the d6 pawn? d6 is a weak pawn because it cannot be defended by any other pawn. These three pawns are not weak because black can simply push them one step forward and these pawns are defended. These three pawns can defend themselves. So these three pawns are not weak. The weakness in this position is d6 pawn or a7 pawn. Now should we attack the d6 pawn or a7 pawn? It depends on the placement of our pieces. Let's put some pieces in this position. Now look at the position of our pieces. There is no way for our pieces to attack this a7 pawn. So a7 pawn is not a weakness in this position. But our pieces can easily attack d6 pawn. Rook is already attacking d6 pawn and we can easily play queen d2, which will bring one more attacker on the d6 pawn. So in this case a7 is not really a weak pawn because we cannot attack it. The weakness of a7 pawn is irrelevant and the main weakness is d6 pawn. We have to focus our attention on d6 pawn. Let's play queen d2. We are attacking this pawn twice and black has to protect it one more time. black can play rook d8. Now we can bring one more attacker on this weak pawn. We can play pawn to e5. And black cannot capture our pawn because after d cross e5, we can play rook cross d8 and we will win one rook. Let's go back. So here black has to play something else. Let's say black plays king f8 and now we can simply win this pawn. And we have the material advantage of 1 point. That's how we identify a weak pawn, then we attack the weak pawn and win it. I hope the concept of weak pawn is clear to you. See you in the next video.